Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 25. The Little Countess. Cheerful as my godmother naturally was, and entertaining as, for our sakes, she made a point of being, there was no true enjoyment that evening at La Terrasse till, through the wild howl of the winter night, were heard the signal sounds of arrival. How often, while women and girls sit warm at snug firesides, their hearts and imaginations are doomed to divorce from the comfort surrounding their persons, forced out by night to wander through dark ways, to dare stress of weather, to contend with the snow blast, to wait at lonely gates and stiles in wildest storms, watching and listening to see and hear the father, the son, the husband coming home. Father and son came at last to the château, for the Count de Bassompierre that night accompanied Dr. Bretton. I know not which of our trio heard the horses first. The asperity, the violence of the weather warranted our running down into the hall to meet and greet the two riders as they came in, but they warned us to keep our distance. Both were white, two moving mountains of snow, and indeed Mrs. Bretton, seeing their condition, ordered them instantly to the kitchen, prohibiting them at their peril from setting foot on her carpeted staircase till they had severally put off that mask of old Christmas they now affected. Into the kitchen, however, we could not help following them. It was a large old Dutch kitchen, picturesque and pleasant. The little white Countess danced in a circle about her equally white sire, clapping her hands and crying, "Papa, Papa, you look like an enormous polar bear." The bear shook himself, and the little sprite fled far from the frozen shower. Back she came, however, laughing and eager to aid in removing the Arctic disguise. The Count, at last issuing from his dreadnought, threatened to overwhelm her with it, as with an avalanche. "Come, then," said she, bending to invite the fall, and when it was playfully advanced above her head, bounding out of reach like some little chamois. Her movements had the supple softness, the velvet grace of a kitten. Her laugh was clearer than the ring of silver and crystal, as she took her sire's cold hands and rubbed them, and stood on tiptoe to reach his lips for a kiss. There seemed to shine round her a halo of loving delight. The grave and reverend Signor looked down on her, as men do look on what is the apple of their eye. "Mrs. Bretton," said he, "what am I to do with this daughter or daughterling of mine? She neither grows in wisdom nor in stature. Don't you find her pretty nearly as much the child as she was 10 years ago?" "She cannot be more the child than this great boy of mine," said Mrs. Bretton, who was in conflict with her son about some change of dress she deemed advisable, and which he resisted. He stood leaning against the Dutch dresser, laughing and keeping her at arm's length. "Come, mamma," said he, "by way of compromise, and to secure for us inward as well as outward warmth, let us have a Christmas wassail cup, and toast old England here on the hearth." So, while the Count stood by the fire, and Paulina Mary still danced to and fro, happy in the liberty of the wide hall-like kitchen, Mrs. Bretton herself instructed Martha to spice and heat the wassail bowl, and, pouring the draught into a Bretton flagon, it was served round, reaming hot, by means of a small silver vessel, which I recognized as Graham's christening cup. "Here's to auld lang syne," said the Count, holding the glancing cup on high. Then, looking at Mrs. Bretton, "We twa hae paid Letty the burn from morning sun till dine, but seas between us braid her on sin auld lang syne. And surely I'll be your kind stoup, as surely I'll be mine, and we'll taste a cup o' kindness yet for auld lang syne." "Scotch! Scotch!" cried Paulina. "Papa is talking Scotch, and Scotch he is partly. We are home and de Bassompierre, Caledonian and Gallic." "And is that a Scotch reel you are dancing, you Highland fairy?" asked her father. "Mrs. Bretton, there will be a green ring growing up in the middle of your kitchen shortly. I would not answer for her being quite canny. She is a strange little mortal." "Tell Lucy to dance with me, papa. There is Lucy Snowe." Mr. Home, There was still quite as much about him of plain Mr. Home as of proud Count de Bassompierre, held his hand out to me, saying kindly, he remembered me well, and even had his own memory been less trustworthy, my name was so often on his daughter's lips, and he had listened to so many long tales about me, I should seem like an old acquaintance. Everyone now had tasted the wassail cup except Paulina, whose pas de fée ou de fantaisie nobody thought of interrupting to offer so profanatory a draught, but she was not to be overlooked, nor balked of her mortal privileges. "Let me taste," said she to Graham, as he was putting the cup on the shelf of the dresser out of her reach. Mrs. Bretton and Mr. Home were now engaged in conversation. Dr. John had not been unobservant of the fairies' dance. He had watched it, and he had liked it. To say nothing of the softness and beauty of the movements, eminently grateful to his grace-loving eyes, that ease in his mother's house charmed him, for it set him at ease. Again she seemed a child for him, again almost his playmate. I wondered how he would speak to her. I had not yet seen him address her. His first words proved that the old days of little Polly had been recalled to his mind by this evening's childlike light-heartedness. "Your ladyship wishes for the tankard?" "I think I said so. I think I intimated as much." "Couldn't consent to a step of the kind on any account. Sorry for it, but couldn't do it." "Why? I am quite well now. It can't break my collarbone again, or dislocate my shoulder." "Is it wine?" "No, nor dew." "I don't want dew. I don't like dew. But what is it?" "Ale, strong ale. Old October. Brewed, perhaps, when I was born." "It must be curious. Is it good?" "Excessively good." And he took it down, administered to himself a second dose of this mighty elixir, expressed in his mischievous eyes extreme contentment with the same, and solemnly replaced the cup on the shelf. "I should like a little," said Paulina, looking up. "I never had any old October. Is it sweet?" "Perilously sweet," said Graham. She continued to look up exactly with the countenance of a child that longs for some prohibited dainty. At last the doctor relented, took it down, and indulged himself in the gratification of letting her taste from his hand. His eyes, always expressive in the revelation of pleasurable feelings, luminously and smilingly avowed that it was a gratification, and he prolonged it by so regulating the position of the cup that only a drop at a time could reach the rosy, sipping lips by which its brim was courted. "A little more," said she, petulantly touching his hand with her forefinger to make him incline the cup more generously and yieldingly. "It smells of spice and sugar, but I can't taste it. Your wrist is so stiff, and you are so stingy." He indulged her, whispering, however, with gravity, "Don't tell my mother or Lucy. They wouldn't approve." "Nor do I," said she, passing into another tone and manner as soon as she had fairly essayed the beverage, just as if it had acted upon her like some disenchanting draught, undoing the work of a wizard. "I find it anything but sweet. It is bitter and hot, and takes away my breath. Your old October was only desirable while forbidden. Thank you, no more." And, with a slight bend, careless but as graceful as her dance, she glided from him and rejoined her father. I think she had spoken truth. The child of 7 was in the girl of 17. Graham looked after her a little baffled, a little puzzled. His eye was on her a good deal during the rest of the evening, but she did not seem to notice him. As we ascended to the drawing-room for tea, she took her father's arm. Her natural place seemed to be at his side. Her eyes and her ears were dedicated to him. He and Mrs. Bretton were the chief talkers of our little party, and Paulina was their best listener, attending closely to all that was said, prompting the repetition of this or that trait or adventure. "And where were you at such a time, papa? And what did you say then? And tell Mrs. Bretton what happened on that occasion." Thus she drew him out. She did not again yield to any effervescence of glee. The infantine sparkle was exhaled for the night. She was soft, thoughtful, and docile. It was pretty to see her bid good night. Her manner to Graham was touched with dignity. In her very slight smile and quiet bow spoke the Countess, and Graham could not but look grave and bend responsive. I saw he hardly knew how to blend together in his ideas the dancing fairy and the delicate dame. Next day, when we were all assembled round the breakfast table, shivering and fresh from the morning's chill ablutions, Mrs. Bretton pronounced a decree that nobody, who was not forced by dire necessity, should quit her house that day. Indeed, egress seemed next to impossible. The drift darkened the lower panes of the casement, and, on looking out, one saw the sky and air vexed and dim, the wind and snow in angry conflict. There was no fall now, but what had already descended was torn up from the earth, whirled round by brief shrieking gusts, and cast into 100 fantastic forms. The Countess seconded Mrs. Bretton. "Papa shall not go out," said she, placing a seat for herself beside her father's armchair. "I will look after him. You won't go into town, will you, papa?" "Aye, and no," was the answer. "If you and Mrs. Bretton are very good to me, Polly, kind, you know, and attentive, if you pet me in a very nice manner, and make much of me, I may possibly be induced to wait an hour after breakfast, and see whether this razor-edged wind settles. But, you see, you give me no breakfast, you offer me nothing, you let me starve." "Quick, please, Mrs. Bretton, and pour out the coffee," entreated Paulina, "whilst I take care of the Count de Bassompierre in other respects. Since he grew into a count, he has needed so much attention." She separated and prepared a roll. "There, papa, are your pistolets charged," said she. "And there is some marmalade, just the same sort of marmalade we used to have at Bretton, and which you said was as good as if it had been conserved in Scotland." "And which your little ladyship used to beg for my boy. Do you remember that?" interposed Mrs. Bretton. "Have you forgotten how you would come to my elbow and touch my sleeve with the whisper, 'Please, ma'am, something good for Graham, a little marmalade, or honey, or jam?'" "No, mamma," broke in Dr. John, laughing, yet reddening. "It surely was not so. I could not have cared for these things." "Did he or did he not, Paulina?" "He liked them," asserted Paulina. "Never blush for it, John," said Mr. Home, encouragingly. "I like them myself yet, and always did. And Polly showed her sense in catering for a friend's material comforts. It was I who put her into the way of such good manners, nor do I let her forget them. Polly, offer me a slice of that tongue. There, papa, but remember you are only waited upon with this assiduity on condition of being persuadable and reconciling yourself to La Terrasse for the day." "Mrs. Bretton," said the Count, "I want to get rid of my daughter and send her to school. Do you know of any good school?" "There's Lucy's place, Madame Beck's." "Miss Snowe is in a school?" "I am a teacher," I said, and was rather glad of the opportunity of saying this. For a little while I had been feeling as if placed in a false position. Mrs. Bretton and her son knew my circumstances, but the Count and his daughter did not. They might choose to vary by some shades their hitherto cordial manner towards me when aware of my grade in society. I spoke then readily, but a swarm of thoughts I had not anticipated nor invoked rose dim at the words, making me sigh involuntarily. Mr. Home did not lift his eyes from his breakfast plate for about 2 minutes, nor did he speak. Perhaps he had not caught the words. Perhaps he thought that on a confession of that nature, politeness would interdict comment. The Scotch are proverbially proud. And homely as was Mr. Home in look, simple in habits and tastes, I have all along intimated that he was not without his share of the national quality. Was his a pseudo-pride? Was it real dignity? I leave the question undecided in its wide sense. Where it concerned me individually, I can only answer, then and always, he showed himself a true-hearted gentleman. By nature he was a feeler and a thinker. Over his emotions and his reflections spread a mellowing of melancholy, more than a mellowing. In trouble and bereavement it became a cloud. He did not know much about Lucy Snowe. What he knew he did not very accurately comprehend. Indeed, his misconceptions of my character often made me smile. But he saw my walk in life lay rather on the shady side of the hill. He gave me credit for doing my endeavour to keep the course honestly straight. He would have helped me if he could. Having no opportunity of helping, he still wished me well. When he did look at me, his eye was kind. When he did speak, his voice was benevolent. "Yours," said he, "is an arduous calling. I wish you health and strength to win it. Success." His fair little daughter did not take the information quite so composedly. She fixed on me a pair of eyes wide with wonder, almost dismay. "Are you a teacher?" cried she. Then, having paused on the unpalatable idea, "Well, I never knew what you were, nor ever thought of asking. For me, you were always Lucy Snowe." "And what am I now?" I could not forbear inquiring. "Yourself, of course. But do you really teach here in Villette?" "I really do." "And do you like it?" "Not always." "And why do you go on with it?" Her father looked at, and, I feared, was going to check her; but he only said, "Proceed, Polly, proceed with that catechism; prove yourself the little wiseacre you are. If Miss Snowe were to blush and look confused, I should have to bid you hold your tongue, and you and I would sit out the present meal in some disgrace. But she only smiles, so push her hard; multiply the cross-questions. Well, Miss Snowe, why do you go on with it?" "Chiefly, I fear, for the sake of the money I get." "Not from motives of pure philanthropy?" Polly and I were clinging to that hypothesis as the most lenient way of accounting for your eccentricity. "No, no, sir. Rather for the roof of shelter I am thus enabled to keep over my head, and for the comfort of mind it gives me to think that while I can work for myself, I am spared the pain of being a burden to anybody." "Papa, say what you will, I pity Lucy." "Take up that pity, Miss de Bassompierre. Take it up in both hands, as you might a little callow gosling squattering out of bounds without leave. Put it back in the warm nest of a heart where it issued, and receive in your ear this whisper. If my Polly ever came to know by experience the uncertain nature of this world's goods, I should like her to act as Lucy acts, to work for herself, that she might burden neither kith nor kin." "Yes, papa," said she, pensively and tractably. "But poor Lucy! I thought she was a rich lady, and had rich friends." "You thought like a simpleton. I never thought so. When I had time to consider Lucy's manner and aspect, which was not often, I saw she was one who had to guard and not be guarded, to act and not be served; and this lot has, I imagine, helped her to an experience for which, if she live long enough to realise its full benefit, she may yet bless Providence. But this school," he pursued, changing his tone from grave to gay, "would Madame Beck admit my Polly, do you think, Miss Lucy?" I said there needed but to try, madame; it would soon be seen. She was fond of English pupils. "If you, sir," I added, "will but take Miss de Bassompierre in your carriage this very afternoon, I think I can answer for it that Rosine, the portress, will not be very slow in answering your ring; and madame, I am sure, will put on her best pair of gloves to come into the salon to receive you." "In that case," responded Mr. Home, "I see no sort of necessity there is for delay. Mrs. Hurst can send what she calls her young lady's things after her. Polly can settle down to her horn-book before night; and you, Miss Lucy, I trust, will not disdain to cast an occasional eye upon her, and let me know from time to time how she gets on. I hope you approve of the arrangement, Countess de Bassompierre?" The Countess hemmed and hesitated. "I thought," said she, "I thought I had finished my education." "That only proves how much we may be mistaken in our thoughts. I hold a far different opinion, as most of those will who have been auditors of your profound knowledge of life this morning. Ah, my little girl, thou hast much to learn, and papa ought to have taught thee more than he has done. Come, there's nothing for it but to try Madame Beck, and the weather seems settling, and I have finished my breakfast." "But, papa—" "Well?" "I see an obstacle." "I don't at all." "It is enormous, papa. It can never be got over. It is as large as you in your greatcoat, and the snowdrift on the top." "And like that snowdrift capable of melting?" "No, it is of too solid flesh. It is just your own self. Miss Lucy, warn Madame Beck not to listen to any overtures about taking me, because in the end it would turn out that she would have to take papa too. As he is so teasing, I will just tell tales about him. Mrs. Bretton and all of you listen. About 5 years ago, when I was 12 years old, he took it into his head that he was spoiling me, that I was growing unfitted for the world, and I don't know what, and nothing would serve or satisfy him but I must go to school. I cried, and so on; but Monsieur de Bassompierre proved hard-hearted, quite firm and flinty, and to school I went. What was the result? In the most admirable manner, papa came to school likewise. Every other day he called to see me. Madame Aigredoux grumbled, but it was of no use; and so at last papa and I were both, in a manner, expelled. Lucy can just tell Madame Beck this little trait: it is only fair to let her know what she has to expect." Mrs. Bretton asked Mr. Home what he had to say in answer to this statement. As he made no defence, judgment was given against him, and Paulina triumphed. But she had other moods besides the arch and the naïve. After breakfast, when the two elders withdrew, I suppose to talk over certain of Mrs. Bretton's business matters, and the Countess, Dr. Bretton, and I were for a short time alone together, all the child left her. With us, more nearly her companions in age, she rose at once to the little lady. Her very face seemed to alter. That play of feature and candour of look, which, when she spoke to her father, made it quite dimpled and round, yielded to an aspect more thoughtful, and lines distincter and less mobile. No doubt Graham noted the change as well as I. He stood for some minutes near the window, looking out at the snow. Presently he approached the hearth, and entered into conversation, but not quite with his usual ease. Fit topics did not seem to rise to his lips. He chose them fastidiously, hesitatingly, and consequently infelicitously. He spoke vaguely of Villette, its inhabitants, its notable sights and buildings. He was answered by Miss de Bassompierre in quite womanly sort, with intelligence, with a manner not indeed wholly disindividualized. A tone, a glance, a gesture, here and there, rather animated and quick than measured and stately, still recalled little Polly; but yet there was so fine and even a polish, so calm and courteous a grace, gilding and sustaining these peculiarities, that a less sensitive man than Graham would not have ventured to seize upon them as vantage points leading to franker intimacy. Yet while Dr. Bretton continued subdued, and, for him, sedate, he was still observant. Not one of those pretty impulses and natural breaks escaped him. He did not miss one characteristic movement, one hesitation in language, or one lisp in utterance. At times, in speaking fast, she still lisped, but coloured whenever such lapse occurred, and in a painstaking, conscientious manner, quite as amusing as the slight error, repeated the word more distinctly. Whenever she did this, Dr. Bretton smiled. Gradually, as they conversed, the restraint on each side slackened. Might the conference have but been prolonged, I believe it would soon have become genial. Already to Paulina's lip and cheek returned the wreathing, dimpling smile. She lisped once, and forgot to correct herself. And Dr. John, I know not how he changed, but changed he did. He did not grow gayer; no raillery, no levity sparkled across his aspect, but his position seemed to become one of more pleasure to himself, and he spoke his augmented comfort in readier language, in tones more suave. 10 years ago this pair had always found abundance to say to each other. The intervening decade had not narrowed the experience or impoverished the intelligence of either. Besides, there are certain natures of which the mutual influence is such that the more they say, the more they have to say. For these, out of association grows adhesion, and out of adhesion, amalgamation. Graham, however, must go. His was a profession whose claims are neither to be ignored nor deferred. He left the room, but before he could leave the house there was a return. I am sure he came back, not for the paper or card in his desk, which formed his ostensible errand, but to assure himself, by one more glance, that Paulina's aspect was really such as memory was bearing away, that he had not been viewing her somehow by a partial, artificial light, and making a fond mistake. No, he found his impression true. Rather, indeed, he gained than lost by this return. He took away with him a parting look, shy but very soft, as beautiful, as innocent as any little fawn could lift out of its cover of fern, or any lamb from its meadow-bed. Being left alone, Paulina and I kept silence for some time. We both took out some work, and plied a mute and diligent task. The white wood work-box of old days was now replaced by one inlaid with precious mosaic, and furnished with implements of gold. The tiny and trembling fingers that could scarce guide the needle, though tiny still, were now swift and skilful. But there was the same busy knitting of the brow, the same little dainty mannerisms, the same quick turns and movements, now to replace a stray tress, and anon to shake from the silken shirt some imaginary atom of dust, some clinging fibre of thread. That morning I was disposed for silence. The austere fury of the winter day had on me an awing, hushing influence. That passion of January, so white and so bloodless, was not yet spent. The storm had raved itself hoarse, but seemed no nearer exhaustion. Had Ginevra Fanshawe been my companion in that morning room, she would not have suffered me to muse and listen undisturbed. The presents just gone from us would have been her theme, and how she would have rung the changes on one topic, how she would have pursued and pestered me with questions and surmises, worried and oppressed me with comments and confidences I did not want, and longed to avoid. Paulina Mary cast once or twice towards me in a quiet but penetrating glance of her dark, full eye, her lips half opened, as if to the impulse of coming utterance, but she saw and delicately respected my inclination for silence. This will not hold long, I thought to myself, for I was not accustomed to find in women or girls any power of self-control, or strength of self-denial. As far as I knew them, the chance of a gossip about their usually trivial secrets, their often very washy and paltry feelings, was a treat not to be readily foregone. The little Countess promised an exception. She sewed till she was tired of sewing, and then she took a book. As chance would have it, she had sought it in Dr. Bretton's own compartment of the bookcase, and it proved to be an old Breton book, some illustrated work of natural history. Often had I seen her standing at Graham's side, resting that volume on his knee, and reading to his tuition, and when the lesson was over, begging as a treat that he would tell her all about the pictures. I watched her keenly. Here was a true test of that memory she had boasted. Would her recollections now be faithful? Faithful? It could not be doubted. As she turned the leaves, over her face passed gleam after gleam of expression, the least intelligent of which was a full greeting to the past. And then she turned to the title page, and looked at the name written in the schoolboy hand. She looked at it long, nor was she satisfied with merely looking. She gently passed over the characters the tips of her fingers, accompanying the action with an unconscious but tender smile, which converted the touch into a caress. Paulina loved the past, but the peculiarity of this little scene was, that she said nothing. She could feel without pouring out her feelings in a flux of words. She now occupied herself at the bookcase for nearly an hour, taking down volume after volume, and renewing her acquaintance with each. This done, she seated herself on a low stool, rested her cheek on her hand, and thought, and still was mute. The sound of the front door opened below, a rush of cold wind, and her father's voice speaking to Mrs. Bretton in the hall, startled her at last. She sprang up. She was downstairs in 1 second. "Papa! Papa! You are not going out?" "My pet, I must go into town." "But it is too cold, papa." And then I heard Monsieur de Bassompierre showing to her how he was well provided against the weather, and how he was going to have the carriage, and to be quite snugly sheltered, and, in short, proving that she need not fear for his comfort. "But you will promise to come back here this evening, before it is quite dark? You and Dr. Bretton, both, in the carriage? It is not fit to ride." "Well, if I see the doctor, I will tell him a lady has laid on him her commands to take care of his precious health, and come home early under my escort." "Yes, you must say 'a lady,' and he will think it is his mother, and be obedient. And, papa, mind to come soon, for I shall watch and listen." The door closed, and the carriage rolled softly through the snow, and back returned the Countess, pensive and anxious. She did listen and watch when evening closed, but it was in stillest sort, walking the drawing-room with quiet, noiseless step. She checked at intervals her velvet march, inclined her ear, and consulted the night sounds. I should rather say the night silence, for now at last the wind was fallen. The sky, relieved of its avalanche, lay naked and pale. Through the barren boughs of the avenue we could see it well, and note also the polar splendour of the New Year moon, an orb white as a world of ice. Nor was it late when we saw also the return of the carriage. Paulina had no dance of welcome for this evening. It was with a sort of gravity that she took immediate possession of her father as he entered the room, but she at once made him her entire property, led him to the seat of her choice, and, while softly showering round him honeyed words of commendation for being so good and coming home so soon, you would have thought it was entirely by the power of her little hands he was put into his chair and settled and arranged. For the strong man seemed to take pleasure in wholly yielding himself to this dominion, potent only by love. Graham did not appear till some minutes after the Count. Paulina half turned when his step was heard. They spoke, but only a word or two. Their fingers met a moment, but obviously with slight contact. Paulina remained beside her father. Graham threw himself into a seat on the other side of the room. It was well that Mrs. Bretton and Mr. Home had a great deal to say to each other, almost an inexhaustible fund of discourse and old recollections. Otherwise, I think, our party would have been but a still one that evening. After tea, Paulina's quick needle and pretty golden thimble were busily plied by the lamplight, but her tongue rested, and her eyes seemed reluctant to raise often their lids so smooth and so full-fringed. Graham, too, must have been tired with his day's work. He listened dutifully to his elders and betters, said very little himself, and followed with his eye the gilded glance of Paulina's thimble, as if it had been some bright moth on the wing, or the golden head of some darting little yellow serpent. End of chapter 25.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded in New South Wales, Australia, August 2006. Villette by Charlotte Brontë, Chapter 26, A Burial. From this date my life did not want variety. I went out a good deal with the entire consent of Madame Beck, who perfectly approved the grade of my acquaintance. That worthy directress had never from the first treated me otherwise than with respect, and when she found that I was liable to frequent invitations from a chateau and a great hotel, respect improved into distinction. Not that she was fulsome about it. Madame, in all things worldly, was in nothing weak. There was measure and sense in her hottest pursuit of self-interest, calm and considerateness in her closest clutch of gain. Without then laying herself open to my contempt as a time-server and a toady, she marked with tact that she was pleased people connected with her establishment should frequent such associates as must cultivate and elevate, rather than those who might deteriorate and depress. She never praised either me or my friends. Only once, when she was sitting in the sun in the garden, a cup of coffee at her elbow and the Gazette in her hand, looking very comfortable, and I came up and asked leave of absence for the evening, she delivered herself in this gracious sort. Oui, oui, ma bonne amie, je vous donne la permission de cœur et de gré. Votre travail dans ma maison a toujours été admirable, rempli de zèle et de discrétion. Vous avez bien le droit de vous amuser. Sautez donc tant que vous voudrez. Quant à votre choix de connaissances, j'en suis contente. C'est sage, digne, laudable. She closed her lips and resumed the Gazette. The reader will not too gravely regard the little circumstance that about this time the triply enclosed packet of 5 letters temporarily disappeared from my bureau. Blank dismay was naturally my first sensation on making the discovery, but in a moment I took heart of grace. "Patience," I whispered to myself. "Let me say nothing, but wait peaceably. They will come back again." And they did come back. They had only been on a short visit to Madame's chamber. Having passed their examination, they came back duly and truly. I found them all right the next day. I wonder what she thought of my correspondence. What estimate did she form of Dr. John Bretton's epistolary powers? In what light did the often very pithy thoughts, the generally sound and sometimes original opinions set, without pretension, in an easily flowing, spirited style, appear to her? How did she like that genial, half-humorous vein which gave me such delight? What did she think of the few kind words scattered here and there, not thickly as the diamonds were scattered in the valley of Sinbad, but sparely as those gems lie in unfabled beds? Oh, Madame Beck, how seemed these things to you? I think in Madame Beck's eyes the 5 letters found a certain favour. One day after she had borrowed them of me, in speaking of so suave a little woman one ought to use suave terms, I caught her examining me with a steady, contemplative gaze, a little puzzled, but not at all malevolent. It was during that brief space between lessons, when the pupils turned out into the court for a quarter of an hour's recreation, she and I remained in the first class alone. When I met her eye, her thoughts forced themselves partially through her lips. "Il y a," said she, "quelque chose de bien remarquable dans le caractère anglais." "How, madame?" She gave a little laugh, repeating the word how in English. "Je ne saurais vous dire how, mais enfin, les Anglais ont des idées à eux, en amitié, en amour, en tout. Mais au moins, il n'est pas besoin de les surveiller," she added, getting up and trotting away like the compact little pony she was. "Then I hope," murmured I to myself, "you will graciously let alone my letters for the future." Alas, something came rushing into my eyes, dimming utterly their vision, blocking from sight the schoolroom, the garden, the bright winter sun, as I remembered that never more would letters, such as she had read, come to me. I had seen the last of them. That goodly river on whose banks I had sojourned, of whose waves a few reviving drops had trickled to my lips, was bending to another course. It was leaving my little hut and field forlorn and sand dry, pouring its wealth of waters far away. The change was right, just, natural. Not a word could be said, but I loved my Rhine, my Nile. I had almost worshipped my Ganges, and I grieved that the grand tide should roll estranged, should vanish like a false mirage. Though stoical, I was not quite a stoic. Drops streamed fast on my hands, on my desk. I wept one sultry shower, heavy and brief. But soon I said to myself, "The hope I am bemoaning suffered and made me suffer much. It did not die till it was full time. Following an agony so lingering, death ought to be welcome." Welcomed I endeavoured to make it. Indeed, long pain had made patience a habit. In the end I closed the eyes of my dead, covered its face, and composed its limbs with great calm. The letters, however, must be put away, out of sight. People who have undergone bereavement always jealously gather together and lock away mementos. It is not supportable to be stabbed in the heart each moment by sharp revival of regret. One vacant holiday afternoon, the Thursday, going to my treasure, with intent to consider its final disposal, I perceived, and this time with a strong impulse of displeasure, that it had been again tampered with. The packet was there indeed, but the ribbon which secured it had been untied and retied, and by other symptoms I knew that my drawer had been visited. This was a little too much. Madame Beck herself was the soul of discretion, besides having as strong a brain and sound a judgment as ever furnished a human head. That she should know the contents of my casket was not pleasant, but might be borne. Little Jesuit inquisitress as she was, she could see things in a true light, and understand them in an unperverted sense. But the idea that she had ventured to communicate information, thus gained, to others, that she had perhaps amused herself with a companion over documents, in my eyes most sacred, shocked me cruelly. Yet such was the case I now saw reason to fear. I even guessed her confidant. Her kinsman, Monsieur Paul Emmanuel, had spent yesterday evening with her. She was much in the habit of consulting him, and of discussing with him matters she broached to no one else. This very morning, in class, that gentleman had favoured me with a glance which he seemed to have borrowed from Vashti, the actress. I had not at the moment comprehended that blue, let lurid flash out of his angry eye, but I read its meaning now. He, I believed, was not apt to regard what concerned me from a fair point of view, nor to judge me with tolerance and candour. I had always found him severe and suspicious. The thought that these letters, mere friendly letters as they were, had fallen once and might fall again into his hands jarred my very soul. What should I do to prevent this? In what corner of this strange house was it possible to find security or secrecy? Where could a key be a safeguard, or a padlock a barrier? In the grenier? No, I did not like the grenier. Besides, most of the boxes and drawers there were mouldering, and did not lock. Rats, too, gnawed their way through the decayed wood, and mice made nests amongst the litter of their contents. My dear letters, most dear still, though Ichabod was written on their covers, might be consumed by vermin. Certainly the writing would soon become obliterated by damp. No, the grenier would not do. But where then? While pondering this problem, I sat in the dormitory window-seat. It was a fine frosty afternoon. The winter sun, already setting, gleamed pale on the tops of the garden shrubs in the allée défendue. One great old pear-tree, the nun's pear-tree, stood up a tall dryad skeleton, grey, gaunt, and stripped. A thought struck me, one of those queer, fantastic thoughts that will sometimes strike solitary people. I put on my bonnet, cloak, and furs, and went out into the city. Bending my steps to the old historical quarter of the town, whose hoaks and overshadowed precincts I always sought by instinct in melancholy moods, I wandered on from street to street, till, having crossed a half-deserted place or square, I found myself before a sort of broker's shop, an ancient place full of ancient things. What I wanted was a metal box which might be soldered, or a thick glass jar or bottle which might be stoppered or sealed hermetically. Amongst miscellaneous heaps I found and purchased the latter article. I then made a little roll of my letters, wrapped them in oiled silk, bound them with twine, and, having put them in the bottle, got the old Jew-broker to stopper, seal, and make it airtight. While obeying my directions, he glanced at me now and then suspiciously from under his frost-white eyelashes. I believe he thought there was some evil deed on hand. In all this I had a dreary something, not pleasure, but a sad, lonely satisfaction. The impulse under which I acted, the mood controlling me, was similar to the impulse and the mood which had induced me to visit the confessional. With quick walking I regained the pensionnat just at dark, and in time for dinner. At 7 o'clock the moon rose. At 7:30, when the pupils and teachers were at study, and Madame Beck was with her mother and children in the salle à manger, when the half-boarders were all gone home, and Rosine had left the vestibule, and all was still, I shawled myself, and, taking the sealed jar, stole out through the first-class door into the berceau, and thence into the allée défendue. Methuselah the pear-tree stood at the further end of this walk, near my seat. He rose up, dim and grey, above the lower shrubs around him. Now Methuselah, though so very old, was of sound timber still. Only there was a hole, or rather a deep hollow, near his root. I knew there was such a hollow, hidden partly by ivy and creepers growing thick round, and there I meditated hiding my treasure. But I was not only going to hide a treasure, I also meant to bury a grief. That grief over which I had lately been weeping, as I wrapped it in its winding sheet, must be interred. Well, I cleared away the ivy, and found the hole. It was large enough to receive the jar, and I thrust it deep in. In a tool-shed at the bottom of the garden lay the relics of building materials, left off by masons lately employed to repair a part of the premises. I fetched thence a slate and some mortar, put the slate on the hollow, secured it with cement, covered the hole with black mould, and finally replaced the ivy. This done, I rested, leaning against the tree, lingering like any other mourner beside a newly sodded grave. The air of the night was very still, but dim with a peculiar mist, which changed the moonlight into a luminous haze. In this air or this mist there was some quality, electrical perhaps, which acted in strange sort upon me. I felt then as I had felt a year ago in England, on a night when the aurora borealis was streaming and sweeping round heaven, when, belated in lonely fields, I had paused to watch that mustering of an army with banners, that quivering of serried lances, that swift descent of messengers from below the North Star to the dark high keystone of heaven's arch. I felt, not happy, far otherwise, but strong, with reinforced strength. If life be a war, it seemed my destiny to conduct it single-handed. I pondered now how to break up my winter quarters, to leave an encampment where food and forage failed. Perhaps to effect this change, another pitched battle must be fought with fortune. If so, I had a mind to the encounter. Too poor to lose, God might destine me to gain. But what road was open? What plan available? On this question I was still pausing, when the moon, so dim hitherto, seemed to shine out somewhat brighter. A ray gleamed even white before me, and a shadow became distinct and marked. I looked more narrowly to make out the cause of this well-defined contrast appearing a little suddenly in the obscure alley. Whiter and blacker it grew on my eye. It took shape with instantaneous transformation. I stood about 3 yards from a tall, sable-robed, snowy-veiled woman. 5 minutes passed. I neither fled nor shrieked. She was there still. I spoke. "Who are you? And why do you come to me?" She stood mute. She had no face, no features. All below her brow was masked with a white cloth. But she had eyes, and they viewed me. I felt, if not brave, yet a little desperate, and desperation will often suffice to fill the post and do the work of courage. I advanced 1 step. I stretched out my hand, for I meant to touch her. She seemed to recede. I drew nearer. Her recession, still silent, became swift. A mass of shrubs, full-leaved evergreens, laurel, and dense yew intervened between me and what I followed. Having passed that obstacle, I looked and saw nothing. I waited. I said, "If you have any errand to men, come back and deliver it." Nothing spoke or reappeared. This time there was no Dr. John to whom to have recourse. There was no one to whom I dared whisper the words, "I have again seen the nun." Paulina Mary sought my frequent presence in the Rue Crécy. In the old Breton days, though she had never professed herself fond of me, my society had soon become to her a sort of unconscious necessary. I used to notice that if I withdrew to my room, she would speedily come trotting after me, and, opening the door and peeping in, say with her little peremptory accent, "Come down! Why do you sit here by yourself? You must come into the parlour." In the same spirit she urged me now. "Leave the Rue Fossette," she said, "and come and live with us. Papa would give you far more than Madame Beck gives you." Mr. Home himself offered me a handsome sum, thrice my present salary, if I would accept the office of companion to his daughter. I declined. I think I should have declined had I been poorer than I was, and with scantier fund of resource, more stinted narrowness of future prospect. I had not that vocation. I could teach, I could give lessons, but to be either a private governess or a companion was unnatural to me. Rather than fill the former post in any great house, I would deliberately have taken a housemaid's place, bought a strong pair of gloves, swept bedrooms and staircases, and cleaned stoves and locks, in peace and independence. Rather than be a companion, I would have made shirts and starved. I was no bright lady's shadow, not Mr. Bassompierre's. Overcast enough it was my nature often to be, of a subdued habit I was, but the dimness and depression must both be voluntary, such as kept me docile at my desk, in the midst of my now well-accustomed pupils in Madame Beck's first class, or alone at my own bedside, in her dormitory, or in the alley and seat which were called mine, in her garden. My qualifications were not convertible nor adaptable. They could not be made the foil of any gem, the adjunct of any beauty, the appendage of any greatness in Christendom. Madame Beck and I, without assimilating, understood each other well. I was not her companion, nor her children's governess. She left me free. She tied me to nothing, not to herself, not even to her interests. Once, when she had for a fortnight been called from home by a near relation's illness, and on her return, all anxious and full of care about her establishment, lest something in her absence should have gone wrong, finding that matters had proceeded more than usual, and that there was no evidence of glaring neglect, she made each of the teachers a present, in acknowledgment of steadiness. To my bedside she came at 12 o'clock at night, and told me she had no present for me. "I must make fidelity advantageous to the Saint-Pierre," said she. "If I attempt to make it advantageous to you, there will arise misunderstanding between us, perhaps separation. One thing, however, I can do to please you, leave you alone with your liberty. C'est ce que je ferai." She kept her word. Every slight shackle she had ever laid on me, she from that time with quiet hand removed. Thus I had pleasure in voluntarily respecting her rules, gratification in devoting double time, in taking double pains with the pupils she committed to my charge. As to Mary de Bassompierre, I visited her with pleasure, though I would not live with her. My visits soon taught me that it was unlikely even my occasional and voluntary society would long be indispensable to her. Monsieur de Bassompierre, for his part, seemed impervious to this conjecture, blind to this possibility, unconscious as any child to the signs, the likelihoods, the fitful beginnings of what, when it drew to an end, he might not approve. Whether or not he would cordially approve I used to speculate. Difficult to say. He was much taken up with scientific interests, keen, intent, and somewhat oppugnant in what concerned his favourite pursuits, but unsuspicious and trustful in the ordinary affairs of life. From all I could gather, he seemed to regard his daughterling as still but a child, and probably had not yet admitted the notion that others might look on her in a different light. He would speak of what should be done when Polly was a woman, when she should be grown up, and Polly, standing beside his chair, would sometimes smile, and take his honoured head between her little hands, and kiss his iron-grey locks, and at other times she would pout and toss her curls, but she never said, "Papa, I am grown up." She had different moods for different people. With her father she really was still a child, or childlike, affectionate, merry, and playful. With me she was serious and as womanly as thought and feeling could make her. With Mrs. Bretton she was docile and reliant, but not expansive. With Graham she was shy, at present very shy. At moments she tried to be cold. On occasion she endeavoured to shun him. His step made her start. His entrance hushed her. When he spoke, her answers failed of fluency. When he took leave, she remained self-vexed and disconcerted. Even her father noticed this demeanour in her. "My little Polly," he said once, "you live too retired a life. If you grow to be a woman with these shy manners, you will hardly be fitted for society. You really make quite a stranger of Dr. Bretton. How is this? Don't you remember that, as a little girl, you used to be rather partial to him?" "Rather, papa," echoed she, with her slightly dry yet gentle and simple tone. "And you don't like him now? What has he done?" "Nothing. Yes, I like him a little, but we are grown strange to each other." "Then rub it off, Polly. Rub the rust and the strangeness off. Talk away when he is here, and have no fear of him." "He does not talk much. Is he afraid of me, do you think, papa?" "Oh, to be sure, what man would not be afraid of such a little silent lady?" "Then tell him some day not to mind my being silent. Say that it is my way, and that I have no unfriendly intention." "Your way, you little chatterbox? So far from being your way, it is only your whim." "Well, I'll improve, papa." And very pretty was the grace with which, the next day, she tried to keep her word. I saw her make the effort to converse affably with Dr. John on general topics. The attention called into her guest's face a pleasurable glow. He met her with caution, and replied to her in his softest tones, as if there was a kind of gossamer happiness hanging in the air which he feared to disturb by drawing too deep a breath. Certainly in her timid yet earnest advance to friendship it could not be denied that there was a most exquisite and fairy charm. When the doctor was gone, she approached her father's chair. "Did I keep my word, papa? Did I behave better?" "My Polly behaved like a queen. I shall become quite proud of her if this improvement continues. By and by we shall see her receiving my guests with quite a calm, grand manner. Miss Lucy and I will have to look about us, and polish up all our best airs and graces, lest we should be thrown into the shade. Still, Polly, there is a little flutter, a little tendency to stammer now and then, even to lisp, as you lisped when you were 6 years old." "No, papa," interrupted she indignantly. "That can't be true." "I appeal to Miss Lucy. Did she not, in answering Dr. Bretton's questions as to whether she had ever seen the palace of the Prince of Villette, say 'Yes,' when she had been there several times?" "Papa, you are satirical, you are méchant. I can pronounce all the letters of the alphabet as clearly as you can. But tell me this, you are very particular in making me be civil to Dr. Bretton. Do you like him yourself?" "To be sure, for old acquaintance sake I like him. Then he is a very good son to his mother, besides being a kind-hearted fellow and clever in his profession. Yes, the callant is well enough." "Callant? Ah, Scotchman! Papa, is it the Edinburgh or the Aberdeen accent you have?" "Both, my pet, both, and doubtless the Glaswegian into the bargain. It is that which enables me to speak French so well. A good Scots tongue always succeeds well at the French." "The French! Scotch again! Incorrigible, papa! You too need schooling." "Well, Polly, you must persuade Miss Snowe to undertake both you and me, to make you steady and womanly, and me refined and classical." The light in which Monsieur de Bassompierre evidently regarded Miss Snowe used to occasion me much inward edification. What contradictory attributes of character we sometimes find ascribed to us, according to the eye with which we are viewed! Madame Beck esteemed me learned and blue, Miss Fanshawe caustic, ironic, and cynical; Mr. Home a model teacher, the essence of the sedate and discreet, somewhat conventional, perhaps, too strict, limited, and scrupulous, but still the pink and pattern of governess correctness; whilst another person, Professor Paul Emmanuel to wit, never lost an opportunity of intimating his opinion that mine was a rather fiery and rash nature, adventurous, indocile, and audacious. I smiled at them all. If any one knew me, it was little Paulina Mary. As I would not be Paulina's nominal and paid companion, genial and harmonious as I began to find her intercourse, she persuaded me to join her in some study, as a regular and settled means of sustaining communication. She proposed the German language, which, like myself, she found difficult of mastery. We agreed to take our lessons in the Rue Crécy of the same mistress. This arrangement threw us together for some hours of every week. Monsieur le Bassompierre seemed quite pleased. It perfectly met his approbation that Madame Minerva Gravity should associate a portion of her leisure with that of his fair and dear child. The other self-elected judge of mine, the professor in the Rue Fossette, discovering by some surreptitious spying means that I was no longer so stationary as hitherto, but went out regularly at certain hours of certain days, took it upon himself to place me under surveillance. People said Monsieur Emmanuel had been brought up amongst Jesuits. I should more readily have accredited this report had his manoeuvres been better masked. As it was, I doubted it. Never was a more undisguised schemer, a franker, looser intriguer. He would analyse his own machinations, elaborately contrive plots, and forthwith indulge in explanatory boasts of their skill. I know not whether I was more amused or provoked by his stepping up to me one morning, and whispering solemnly that he had his eye on me. He, at least, would discharge the duty of a friend, and not leave me entirely to my own devices. My proceedings seemed at present very unsettled. He did not know what to make of them. He thought his cousin Beck very much to blame in suffering this sort of fluttering inconsistency in a teacher attached to her house. What had a person devoted to a serious calling, that of education, to do with counts and countesses, hotels and châteaux? To him I seemed altogether en l'air. On his faith he believed I went out 6 days in the 7. I said, Monsieur exaggerated. I certainly had enjoyed the advantage of a little change lately, but not before it had become necessary, and the privilege was by no means exercised in excess. Necessary? How was it necessary? I was well enough, he supposed. Change necessary? He would recommend me to look at the Catholic religieuses and study their lives. They asked no change. I am no judge of what expression crossed my face when he thus spoke, but it was one which provoked him. He accused me of being reckless, worldly, and epicurean, ambitious of greatness, and feverishly athirst for the pomps and vanities of life. It seems I had no dévouement, no recueillement in my character, no spirit of grace, faith, sacrifice, or self-abasement. Feeling the inutility of answering these charges, I mutely continued the correction of a pile of English exercises. He could see in me nothing Christian. Like many other Protestants, I revelled in the pride and self-will of paganism. I slightly turned from him, nestling still closer under the wing of silence. A vague sound grumbled between his teeth. It could not surely be a juron. He was too religious for that, but I am certain I heard the word sacré. Grievous to relate, the same word was repeated, with the unequivocal addition of 1000 something, when I passed him about 2 hours afterwards in the corridor, prepared to go and take my German lesson in the Rue Crécy. Never was a better little man in some points than Monsieur Paul. Never, in others, a more waspish little despot. Our German mistress, Fräulein Anna Braun, was a worthy, hearty woman of about 45. She ought perhaps to have lived in the days of Queen Elizabeth, as she habitually consumed for her first and second breakfasts beer and beef. Also her direct and downright Deutsch nature seemed to suffer a sensation of cruel restraint from what she called our English reserve. Though we thought we were very cordial with her, but we did not slap her on the shoulder, and if we consented to kiss her cheek it was done quietly, and without any explosive smack. These omissions oppressed and depressed her considerably. Still, on the whole, we got on very well. Accustomed to instruct foreign girls, who hardly ever will think and study for themselves, who have no idea of grappling with a difficulty and overcoming it by dint of reflection or application, our progress, which in truth was very leisurely, seemed to astound her. In her eyes we were a pair of glacial prodigies, cold, proud, and preternatural. The young Countess was a little proud, a little fastidious, and perhaps with her native delicacy and beauty she had a right to these feelings. But I think it was a total mistake to ascribe them to me. I never evaded the morning salute, which Paulina would slip when she could, nor was a certain little manner of still disdain a weapon known in my armoury of defence, whereas Paulina always kept it clear, fine, and bright, and any rough German sally called forth at once its steely glisten. Honest Anna Braun, in some measure, felt this difference, and while she half feared, half worshipped Paulina, as a sort of dainty nymph, an Undine, she took refuge with me, as a being all mortal and of easier mood. A book we liked well to read and translate was Schiller's Ballads. Paulina soon learned to read them beautifully. The Fräulein would listen to her with a broad smile of pleasure, and say her voice sounded like music. She translated them too, with a facile flow of language, and with a strain of kindred and poetic fervour. Her cheek would flush, her lips tremblingly smile, her beauteous eyes kindle or melt as she went on. She learned the best by heart, and would often recite them when we were alone together. One she liked well was Des Menschens Klage, that is, she liked well to repeat the words. She found plaintive melody in the sound. The sense she would criticise. She murmured as we sat over the fire one evening, Du Heilige, rufe dein Kind zurück. Ich habe genossen das irdische Glück. Ich habe gelebt und geliebt. Lived and loved, said she. Is that the summit of earthly happiness, the end of life, to love? I don't think it is. It may be the extreme of mortal misery, it may be sheer waste of time and fruitless torture of feeling. If Schiller had said to be loved, he might have come nearer the truth. Is not that another thing, Lucy? To be loved? I suppose it may be. But why consider the subject? What is love to you? What do you know about it? She crimsoned, half in irritation, half in shame. Now, Lucy, she said, I won't take that from you. It may be well for papa to look upon me as a baby. I rather prefer that he should thus view me. But you know and shall learn to acknowledge that I am verging on my 19th year. No matter if it were your 29th. We will anticipate no feelings by discussion and conversation. We will not talk about love. Indeed, indeed, said she, all in hurry and heat. You may think to check and hold me in as much as you please, but I have talked about it, and heard about it too, and a great deal and lately, and disagreeably and detrimentally, and in a way you wouldn't approve. And the vexed, triumphant, pretty, naughty being laughed. I could not discern what she meant, and I would not ask her. I was nonplussed. Seeing, however, the utmost innocence in her countenance, combined with some transient perverseness and petulance, I said at last, Who talks to you disagreeably and detrimentally on such matters? Who that has near access to you would dare to do it? Lucy, replied she more softly, it is a person who makes me miserable sometimes, and I wish she would keep away. I don't want her. But who, Paulina, can it be? You puzzle me much. It is my cousin, Ginevra. Every time she has leave to visit Mrs. Cholmondeley, she calls here, and whenever she finds me alone, she begins to talk about her admirers. Love, indeed! You should hear all she has to say about love. Oh, I have heard it, said I quite coolly, and on the whole, perhaps it is as well you should have heard it too. It is not to be regretted, it is all right. Yet surely Ginevra's mind cannot influence yours. You can look over both her head and her heart. She does influence me very much. She has the art of disturbing my happiness and unsettling my opinions. She hurts me through the feelings and people dearest to me. What does she say, Paulina? Give me some idea. There may be counteraction of the damage done. The people I have longest and most esteemed are degraded by her. She does not spare Mrs. Bretton. She does not spare Graham. No, I dare say. And how does she mix up these with her sentiment and her love? She does mix them, I suppose. Lucy, she is insolent, and, I believe, false. You know Dr. Bretton. We both know him. He may be careless and proud, but when was he ever mean or slavish? Day after day she shows him to me kneeling at her feet, pursuing her like a shadow, she repulsing him with insult, and he imploring her with infatuation. Lucy, is it true? Is any of it true? It may be true that he once thought her handsome. Does she give her out as still her suitor? She says she might marry him any day. He only waits her consent. It is these tales which have caused that reserve in your manner towards Graham which your father noticed. They have certainly made me all doubtful about his character. As Ginevra speaks, they do not carry with them the sound of unmixed truth. I believe she exaggerates, perhaps invents, but I want to know how far. Suppose we bring Miss Fanshawe to some proof. Give her an opportunity of displaying the power she boasts. I could do that to-morrow. Papa has asked some gentlemen to dinner, all savants. Graham, who, Papa is beginning to discover, is a savant too, skilled, they say, in more than one branch of science, is among the number. Now I should be miserable to sit at table unsupported amid such a party. I could not talk to Messieurs A and Z, the Parisian academicians. All my new credit for manner would be put in peril. You and Mrs. Bretton must come for my sake. Ginevra, at a word, will join you. Yes, then will I carry a message of invitation, and she shall have the chance of justifying her character for veracity. End of chapter 26.